Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. I read a really interesting article written by a graduate student in political science at McGill University, John Medicoff is his name, about regional governance in Montreal versus Toronto. And it really raises a lot of very interesting questions. And so I thought it would be great to check in with him and find out about why he wrote this article and what the conclusions are. So Josh Medicoff, welcome to our show.
Thanks for having me. Happy to be here.
That's great. Thank you for coming and joining us. So Josh is a graduate student at McGill University's Department of Political Science, as I mentioned. He's held positions at the City of Montreal, the Pembina Institute, and is it Blaise Transit?
It's Blaise Transit, but you can pronounce it that way if you want.
Blaise Transit, not Blaise. Okay, I apologize. Blaise Transit. And he's written a thesis, and his thesis concerns regional governance in Montreal and Toronto and focuses on how environmental issues should be governed or are governed in those different regions. And it was absolutely fascinating. Maybe you could tell us a little bit, if you could, Josh, about how regional government is very different in Montreal versus Toronto.
Yeah, it's probably best to start with the general idea of regional government in Canada and how cities function in Canada's system. Cities are what we call creatures of the provinces. They're created by provincial acts. Because cities are not mentioned in Canada's constitution. So they have no constitutional power, no ability to set the ways that they act with provinces, no ability to set the ways that they act with the federal government, apart from the way that provinces enable them to do that. And so that means that across Canada, you have a huge variation in the ways that cities are managed and city regions are managed. So basically, the way that Vancouver is governed is going to be completely different than the way that Montreal is governed. It's going to be completely different than the way that Toronto is governed. And the way that Toronto works is that there's 5 sub-regions between the province and the municipalities. There's Peel Region, Halton Region, Durham Region. There's the City of Toronto. Which one am I forgetting? Peel Region, and there's...
York.
Say that again?
York.
And York Region, sorry. There's so many to remember. But by contrast, you have...
Just try to mention the 29 cities and towns.
There's 25. I think there's 25. Maybe there's 29. Anyways, so there's 25 municipalities in the Toronto region, 5 kind of upper tier regions. But by contrast, in Montreal, there's 82 municipalities. And then there's one kind of big tier of government above those called the Montreal Metropolitan Community, or the Communauté Métropolitaine Montréal in French. So a lot of variation, a lot of difference.
Okay, what does this senior regional government in Montreal do?
It adopts a variety of different responsibilities that are mandated by the government of Quebec. So in Montreal, you have everything from it's called the Plan Métropolitain de l'Aménagement et du Développement. So it kind of sets the goals for planning of the region. So how much housing there will be, affordability. It does some water services, transportation, which is done by a different organization. And it kind of sets, a variety of targets that it wants the regions to adopt. Or wants the municipalities to adopt. Versus in Toronto, you have 5 different regions that are setting the same plans for very similar services, but there's 5 different ones. So they're all adopting different ones according to what the municipalities want within those regions.
And do you think that there's regional integration in Montreal and regional collaboration and planning that just doesn't take place in Toronto because of the separation into the 5 different regions?
I mean, that's the kind of question that my research is attempting to understand. I generally think, and I think that there's some results that will show that the fact that Montreal has just one upper tier municipality that all 82 municipalities can collaborate with. So Montreal, the city of Laval, the city of Longueuil can all get together to kind of strategize on what they want to do regionally. I think that enables a bit more coherence on regional services. So, for example, say, there's a river that crosses Montreal and Laval that goes between the two. And say the two want to figure out a certain way to manage floods. It means that through this upper tier municipality, they can do that together on an easier way than if they were doing it alone. Versus in Toronto, there's a kind of more difficult way that the regions have to collaborate. There's no kind of official way that York Region and the city of Toronto can get together to discuss a specific issue. So say that there's a highway that'll cross between both regions. They have to go to the province, and the province sets the way that the highway will work interregionally. So I think that there's in some ways, the city or the region of Montreal has an easier time setting kind of or creating a level of regional coherence versus in Toronto, it's a bit harder because it's very fragmented.
Is there a mayor or a chair of this regional government in Montreal?
In Montreal, the de facto chair is the mayor of Montreal, so that would be Valérie Plante right now. But it's kind of like a kind of complicated system where each municipality, each of the big municipalities appoints a certain amount of council members on the Montreal Metropolitan Communities Board, and then they go from there and there's subcommittees. So it's, given the fact that there's 82 municipalities in the region, it's quite complicated, managing how everybody talks and gets along. But at the same time, the easy thing about the Communauté Métropolitaine de Montréal is that it enables everyone to get together in an easier way and in a very official way as well.
How often do they meet?
That's somewhat unclear, but they meet monthly, and with various different representatives of each municipality as well.
With 82 different municipalities compared to the 25 or 29 in the Greater Toronto area, is there too much fragmentation at the municipal level in Montreal?
You mean on the level that, is there too many municipalities, too many different visions, too many different desires?
Yeah, I think about, Premier Ford amalgamating Toronto into one municipality. Is that something that Montreal needs? Is that a strength that Toronto has that Montreal, with its fragmentation? I understand that Montreal and Westmount, for an example, are two different cities. And, most people think that Westmount's part of Montreal.
Yeah. I mean, you're kind of bringing up a lot of different complex arguments that have been presented in the Montreal region. So, I believe it was in 2003, it was in 2003, the province of Quebec under a Parti Québécois government fused the entire island of Montreal together. So not the entire region, but the island. So right now there's the Ville de Montréal, and I believe there's 15 other municipalities. So that meant that they were all under the administration of La Ville de Montréal, or the city of Montreal. And it created quite a bit of conflict in a way that Toronto maybe doesn't have to deal with. Montreal has a lot of linguistic complexity, obviously, considering Quebec's history. But the vast majority of Anglophones in the Montreal region live on the West Island. And so fusing them all into one municipality in Montreal created a bit of conflict because the city of Montreal is a largely Francophone institution. And it would have meant that service delivery of a lot of the services that municipalities provide would have reverted to French as well. So then in 2006, it defused, and now there's the city of Montreal, 19 boroughs that were former municipalities, and 15 municipalities like Westmount, although Westmount was a bit more recent. Do I think that every city do I think that there should be kind of like a mega city or a mega Montreal that governs the entire island? I tend to think that no. This is like a bit more of a theoretical discussion, but municipalities are kind of, they're considered our local democratic expression. And if municipalities want to do services in English, if they want to do services in French, that's kind of their choice in my perspective. And there's also a level of, or there's a bit of unclarity or there's a lack of compelling evidence that services or that efficiencies occur at a bigger scale. So say you fuse Montreal and Westmount back together. It might mean that, there's a bigger institution. It's a bit clear which city is providing what, but it doesn't mean that it's any more efficient because you still have a bigger bureaucracy, a lot more people managing a lot more people. So anyways, this is one of the lessons from the city of Toronto, or the Metro Toronto's fusion into the city of Toronto, is that it was actually unclear if the costs associated if the process created any cost savings. Because it was really costly to fuse all of the municipalities together. And it's just a bit unclear whether a bigger kind of like apparatus is easier for people to manage.
So there was a paper that I read at one point in time in regards to transportation, and it took a look at Denver, at Los Angeles, at numerous different communities around North America, and said that communities that either got together in some sort of regional government and or a coordination system actually could make those appropriate decisions to build regional transit and transportation, and those that stayed fragmented couldn't and didn't, and ended up not having that transit, not getting developed, and lost from an economic development standpoint. Do you buy that argument?
Yeah, I mean, there's actually there's some compelling arguments in Canada as well around this. And actually, ironically, Montreal is one of the weaker examples. So, I think actually a great example is Vancouver. Vancouver, the in the greater Vancouver area, transportation or public transportation is provided by TransLink, which is like a regional operator. And it really reduces friction between municipalities. So there's different tiers, like different zones that you might have to pay a fare for. But in general, you're only using TransLink to get from Vancouver to Burnaby to Surrey. These are like 3 separate municipalities. In Montreal, by contrast, there's a regional transportation board, and then there's 4 different transportation, like public transportation operators. So there's the Société de Transport de Montréal, the Société de Transport de Laval, the Réseau de Transport de Longueuil, and then there's one called EXO, which does everything else. And it creates a lot of friction for users. A lot of people go between these municipalities, these regions, and transit operators to get home and to work. So I generally do think that transportation is a service that we can look to that might be better provided at the regional scale. Crossing municipal boundaries, crossing regional boundaries, it creates a lot of friction. And so kind of creating one holistic system is generally argued, and I agree that it is a bit easier for users. Just people getting from home to work, from home to see their friends, from work to see their friends. You don't want a really complex system.
So if I want to take transit to go to work, I've got to take Mississauga Transit, pay a fare. Then I transfer to Go Transit, owned by the provincial government, pay a fare, and then get on the Toronto Transit Commission subway and pay a fare, and then take a streetcar, which I actually get to transfer to without having to pay an additional fare. Does that make any sense?
It's a compelling example of why a regional transport authority might be a better option. What you just described is that when you transfer from the subway to the streetcar, you have no friction. You can just go from one to the other and your fare transfers. But when you're going from, you said you're going from Mississauga to the GO
Toronto.
train, then the
GO train to Toronto.
Toronto. Yeah. So what you're seeing is that there's kind of like a bit of fragmentation between these systems. It's not to say that you can't have a regional operator and a municipal operator. I was just in Buenos Aires. Buenos Aires has like municipal subway, and then it also has a regional subway. But the card that you use on the municipal subway also works on the regional subway. You don't have to worry at all about transferring, how much it's going to cost, if there's a fare difference, et cetera, et cetera. So these are like, I think you've highlighted a great a great example as to why kind of regional solutions are needed for regional issues.
Well, the one card in London, England works on something like 42 different bus, train, and other transit by both private and publicly owned entities, and by City of London and other jurisdictions.
Exactly. And it's the same in Vancouver. People in Vancouver have a lot of ease. For example, Vancouver's airport is in Richmond, which is a separate municipality from Vancouver, but you can take the train from Richmond to Vancouver with the same card. It's a slightly more expensive fare, but that doesn't mean anything kind of in the greater scale of like a frictionless service.
We're chatting tonight with Josh Medicoff, a political science student at McGill University, about regional government and his comparison in his thesis between Toronto and Montreal. It's an interesting conversation. Stay with us, everyone. We'll be back in 2 minutes. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. My guest tonight is Josh Medicoff. He's a graduate student in McGill University's Department of Political Science. He's worked at the City of Montreal, Pembina, and Blaise Transit, and he's doing a thesis that I read an article about that concerns regional governance in Montreal and compares it to Toronto, and focuses on environmental issues and how we are all governed in those 2 regions. I think that Josh has got an interesting background. He did his undergraduate at UBC in Vancouver, and he's from Edmonton. So he's lived in the prairies, he's lived on the West Coast, and he's now comparing Toronto and Montreal. And your French is really good.
Much appreciated. The French immersion system treated me well.
That's good. I actually grew up on the West Island of Montreal, even though I live in Toronto now. And so when you talk about, Beaconsfield, Pointe-Claire, Baie-Deux-Ferry, et cetera, I sort of understand that. I always wondered why they were all so many different municipalities. And I guess language was one of those reasons, because at the time, my Francophone friends in downtown Montreal, when I told them I lived in Beaconsfield, would say, "Oh, you live in Beaconsfield, Ontario." because Beaconsfield at the time was very Anglophone, but Beaconsfield is not predominantly Anglophone anymore. And a lot of those municipalities, while they may have sizable English populations, I think have become very integrated and are home to lots of people. Anyway, Josh, I want to come back to this sort of regional governance, and I presume that as part of your whole thesis, you're doing a study of regional government in Ontario as you take a look at Toronto. Regional governance was put in place in Ontario, what was it, 75 years ago or something like that? Maybe it was 50, I can't remember. And it was because the local municipalities weren't of a size that justified having police departments, fire departments, garbage, parks, all the different things. And so they ended up having some of those activities, planning, police, et cetera, being taken over by regional governments. And that was the regional municipality of Toronto when Toronto was a metro, and had 5 different cities as part of it: Etobicoke, Toronto, Scarborough, et cetera. But Peel with Mississauga, Brampton, and Caledon, and Halton with Oakville and Burlington and Milton, and Halton Hills and Georgetown, stayed separate. York with Markham, Richmond Hill, Thornhill, Aurora, etc. And it's always been a wonder about what should happen. And a couple of years ago, Doug Ford, the Premier of Ontario, was making some noises about amalgamation, and people got really scared. At least some people got really scared. Other people thought it was a good idea. In 1996, there was a GTA task force that was organized and reported and called for amalgamation between the cities of in Metro Toronto into Toronto, of the cities in Peel into one city, in Halton into one city, into York into one city, and Durham, which is Whitby, Pickering, and Oshawa into one city. And then those 5 cities, those 4 cities in Toronto, 5 altogether, to form one GTA, Greater Toronto Area, something or other, regional government, and almost recreate the old Metro Toronto government. Not in a regional government, but at least in a coordinating fashion. Some people thought that was brilliant, made a lot of sense to have 5 cities, all of size, and a regional government structure. Some people said, no, it'll be too powerful. It'll be even more powerful than the province of Ontario. And whoever chairs that regional, Greater Toronto Area will be almost like a premier. And so people thought that it wouldn't be put in place because no premier wanted to create another level of government that would be almost as powerful as them. And then other people said, no, you can have 29 different municipalities, just like you've described Montreal as having, this, 80 different municipalities.
Yeah.
What do you think? What's the right way to organize a regional municipality? And actually, let me put one more comment in before I ask you to respond, if I could. I invited Joe Barrage from Urban Strategies, one of the preeminent urban planners in the Toronto area, as well as, frankly, around the world. And he said one of the things about Toronto that people don't realize is that within the next 5 years, Toronto is going to be the 3rd largest metropolitan area in all of North America. It's going to be bigger than Chicago, Dallas, Houston, et cetera. It's going to be rivaling Los Angeles and New York. And we're not planning it like it's going to be that size. We don't have a governance structure. We don't have a vision. We're not thinking about that. And we got to start thinking about that because, and he went on, he said, you think about it from Oshawa to Hamilton or even Niagara Falls, almost contiguous, nonstop metropolitan residential and business economic area. We got to start thinking about it that way. So if you're the expert, because you're just getting your master's in political science and you had to recreate the land of Greater Toronto Area, the Golden Horseshoe, how would you plan it? How would you govern it?
Yeah, well, there's several really interesting questions in that. I'll try to break it down between what you're talking about. I think maybe the first thing that's useful to talk about is amalgamation, which, depending on who you are, maybe it has a really positive connotation or a really negative connotation. So obviously, I think you did a good job of summarizing what happened to the former Metro Toronto, which is that it basically all got amalgamated into the city of Toronto, which is how it is today. And the city of Toronto actually, it technically qualifies as an upper tier municipality, means it has a bit more power in terms of highways and transportation. Like it has its own, it has its own TTC. but it also means that, for example, one of the more controversial aspects of it was that it fused slightly more conservative at the time suburbs into a very progressive, kind of like inner city. And so a lot of people on the political left, on the political right, have a lot of difficulty when it comes to amalgamation, mostly because in the Toronto experience, it was highly motivated politically. And this is kind of like brings a really interesting layer into the conversation, which is that the province of Ontario is I think what you could describe as highly interventionist in municipal affairs. It sees itself kind of freely as like, and it has the constitutional authority to do so, but to intervene in what's happening in municipalities. And I think a great example, I believe this happened in 2018, is when the Doug Ford government shrank Toronto City Council from 47 councillors to 25. Which is, again, completely constitutionally correct. It was upheld by the Supreme Court in 2021. But you could argue that there's kind of a high level of interference there. You have to question a bit of the motivation. So, there's a kind of like complex history of planning in the Toronto region. We can't get through all of it right now. If you were to ask me as a graduate level expert in how to govern the Toronto region, I personally think that the way that Montreal governs itself, through its histories of English language, like English-French tensions, through the kind of idea of local democratic expression, I think that there are some principles that we can take from Montreal's experience and apply to Toronto. First of all, I think that the fact that all of the regions that there's so many regions, like that there's 5 regions. I personally believe that it creates a bit of fragmentation. It means that the regions do not have a kind of easy venue to collaborate. They have no Montreal metropolitan community. They have no, Greater Toronto Area metropolitan community. If Mississauga wants to talk to Toronto, it likely has to go through informal discussions.
Let me stop you and challenge you for a second. There is a Greater Toronto Area meeting that the Premier of Ontario convenes. It is informal. It doesn't have a regular jurisdictional process, and it's the Premier, the Ministry of Municipal Affairs, and 29 different mayors and chairs. And so maybe that's the difference between my 25 and your 25 and my 29, is it includes the regional chairs as well as the mayors of all the places. What I'm told is that effectively, therefore, the Premier is like the mayor of the Greater Toronto Area, and the mayor of Toronto, because he represents or she represents 3.5 million people, and everyone else are kind of small, all the way down to 10,000 or 15,000. That it's the two of them that make the vast majority of the decisions. And I wonder, when you say that the mayor of Montreal is the de facto chair of the regional government in Montreal, I wonder if that's the same thing. Is that you try to have a democratic situation, but when you've got a mixture of places that are huge, Montreal and Toronto, versus small, like Point Claire and Milton, you don't end up having democracy. You don't, the size ends up counting too much. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. Yeah, one of the criticisms that's kind of lobbed sometimes against the Montreal metropolitan community is that Montreal just has too big of a say in what's going on in the region's affairs. At the same time, there's the question of money, and the way that the Montreal metropolitan community works is that you pay based off the size of your municipality or your municipality's GDP. So technically, Montreal, I think it has, there's statistics. I think there's 1.7 million people, 1.9 in the city of Montreal. That means that Montreal pays the most out of every municipality in the region. And so it makes a bit of sense that, if you have the most inhabitants and your city is kind of the thing that drives a lot of people to the region, you have a slightly bigger say in the way that the region kind of directs itself. At the same time, should Montreal be able to dictate everything? And does it dictate everything in the region? No. And that's kind of the value of the Montreal metropolitan community, is that it's able to act as a kind of chair, or as a forum of discussion between all of the municipalities. So, Westmount gets to say its piece. Longueuil gets to say its piece. The kind of teeny municipalities that exist on the fringes get to say their piece. They get to influence the strategic direction of the Montreal region. And by contrast, as you pointed out really usefully, the Toronto region is often kind of governed de facto by the Premier of Toronto. And I think that, there's a degree to which, premiers in Ontario enjoy that. That makes sense. If I was in that kind of like setup, I'd probably enjoy that power as well. It's kind of Canada's city. It's huge. It's an economic powerhouse. You want to have a say in the way that conversations go, that things are structured, the way that money flows. At the same time, is that necessarily the best for the Toronto region? Not necessarily. There are people there are people in the Progressive Conservative Party that aren't elected from the city of Toronto or to the Toronto region, but get to decide in the affairs of the Toronto region, which, that's how our system works. Not necessarily, it's not illegal. It's perfectly permissive in the way that the kind of Ontario has set up its municipal system. Does that mean that the Toronto region gets the best results? Not necessarily.
And that's, I guess, what we're after, is getting the best results for the regional economy. Come back to this thing about, does Montreal get to dictate and does Toronto get to dictate a lot of what's going on in the area just because of their size? One of the reasons why this GTA task force back in 1996 recommended the amalgamation of Peel, Halton, York, and Durham was to create a counterbalance. And, to put it in perspective, each one of those new cities, if they were actually amalgamated, would be over 1 million people. Peel, Mississauga, and Brampton and Caledon would be 1.3 million people. It would be the third largest city in Canada.
Yeah.
And that would create a counterbalance to, still less than half of Toronto, but not 1/10 of Toronto. And so, a far more significant enterprise. And regional government has changed in Ontario. As you probably know, Ontario has seen Ottawa, Gatineau, Canada, Gloucester, etc., Nepean amalgamate. Hamilton has amalgamated. There's several cities that have amalgamated, several regions that have amalgamated the cities together. They've created one city. Have you looked at those? Do those make sense? Do those amalgamations make sense?
Yeah, the short answer is with those regions, not as much, because I'm trying to kind of hyperfixate. The reason why it's useful to compare Montreal and Toronto is that they're the first and second biggest cities and biggest city regions in Canada. The reasons why you'd amalgamate other municipalities, especially rural municipalities, are a bit more complex, and
these aren't rural municipalities. So, in Ottawa, there were several municipalities in Ottawa, around Ottawa, that amalgamated to become a new city of Ottawa that's substantially larger than it was before. Same thing in Hamilton. So they're not rural. They're just they're cities comparable to Peel, where you almost couldn't tell where Ottawa started and Canada. Ottawa ended and Canada started, or Ottawa ended and Gloucester and Orleans started, and they amalgamated into one city, one mayor, one council.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
One of the interesting things that's also presented often with Ottawa, and I think you can see it a little bit in the recent municipal elections in Ottawa, is that you really are amalgamating like very different municipalities. The like southwest and southeast parts of Ottawa are they're actually significantly more rural, for example, than downtown Ottawa, or even the kind of like neighborhoods that ring downtown. There's some like you're kind of mishmashing a lot of different municipalities together in a way that might not necessarily make sense. And I actually think that a distinction might be useful here, which is that an upper tier municipality in Montreal's case isn't necessarily an amalgamation, because the municipalities are still their own. They still have their own elected councils. They still have their own strategic directions. They still have their own kind of, democratic expression. Whereas what we're talking about in the case of Ottawa, and we're talking about in the case of Toronto, and then potentially in Peel as well, is an actual amalgamation between the municipalities. So there would be no more Brampton or Mississauga, right? They would become, I guess, whatever the name would be. Maybe it would be Peel. And so you actually are doing what happened in Ottawa again. And I personally don't know if amalgamation is the smartest move with these kind of things. It means that, you're bringing a bunch of people together that might not necessarily even want to associate in the same city. They might not even actually want to be part of the same municipality. Sometimes people live in Brampton and they might live in a more rural part of Brampton, and maybe they don't want to live in Mississauga, and maybe they don't want. The other thing that's really interesting is that when amalgamations happen, as I discussed in the case of Toronto, from Metro Toronto to the city of Toronto, is that you actually give some parts of the city a lot more power in the other part of the city. So what happened in the case of Toronto is that the council changed a lot. It became slightly more conservative because you fused the kind of, more kind of suburban oriented municipalities like York, or sorry, not York, like Etobicoke, like Scarborough into, the city of Toronto. So you brought downtownites, people who vote kind of a little bit more progressively, a little bit more left, into like more suburban voters who are often more swing voters. So in any case, there's kind of like a lot of reasons why you might criticize amalgamation. I don't think amalgamation is the right way to go in these cases, but I do think that having an upper tier system that allows, those municipalities to collaborate beyond just what Peel is right now might be the right approach.
We're having an interesting conversation with Josh Medicoff, a political science master's student at McGill University, about regional government in Montreal as well as Toronto. We're going to take a break and come back, and he's going to give us a couple of examples of how things work after the break. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. I'm chatting tonight with a really smart graduate student. Josh Medicoff is his name. He's a political science graduate student at McGill University in their political science department. And he's written a really interesting article. I didn't read the whole thesis. I think it's probably from his thesis, that compares regional governance in Montreal versus Toronto. And Montreal has this overall regional governance structure that, what is it, 80 different municipalities get together to come to decisions, versus Toronto that doesn't have one. The city of Toronto obviously has amalgamated, but there's no structure other than a ad hoc committee that Premier Ford brings together once in a while. But there's no way that Mississauga, Brampton, Markham, etc., interact with Toronto on an ongoing basis. It's interesting. Josh, there are some organizations that have really started to almost create the regional government, even before sort of democracy and government catches up. I'm thinking about this new train in Montreal, which I think is called the REM, that goes from Longueuil, South Shore, through Montreal, and I think gets all the way to the airport, and maybe even gets up to Laval. But maybe you could tell me a little bit about that. And I'd like to know how that was put together. Was that done by the provincial government, by the city government, by this regional government structure?
Yeah. I mean, the REM is a really interesting example. It's called the Réseau Express Métropolitain, so the express urban network for a train. It's kind of got like a really weird structure. So it's being created by, or it's being built and financed by Quebec's pension fund. So a kind of like weird system to put in place there. But it's a true kind of like metropolitan, it's like a new metropolitan train network. I think initially it cost around 8 billion, one of the largest transit expansion projects in North America. And you're right, it goes from the South Shore, but it actually crosses through the city of Montreal, goes through the kind of like, it goes through Laval, which is just north of Montreal, and then it goes into the suburbs north of Laval. So it's a kind of huge system. It isn't necessarily directly done in collaboration with the Société de Transport de Montréal, so Montreal's kind of like main public transport authority. And I think that caused a bit of tension because as Montreal does, its kind of transit system dictates a lot of the other transit systems in the region. You now have the Autorité Régionale de Transport Métropolitain, so the Metropolitan Transportation Authority, basically, but it's a bit toothless right now. It's meant to create a kind of like coherent system. But you're right that the REM is a really good example of a regional project that's meant to knit the region together. And it's got several stations in downtown Montreal, and it's kind of primarily meant to bring commuters outside Montreal from the suburbs into Montreal and back. So it's a really interesting system there. It's not necessarily my specialization, but I think that you could probably compare it to the GO train. Who
did they negotiate with when they wanted to create? Did they negotiate with the provincial government, or with the regional Montreal government, or with different cities?
In this case, I believe that it was the province who initiated the project. And did it in collaboration and tried to find vendors. But these kind of projects take a long time to plan. It's done through a P3, so a private-public partnership. That's why the pension fund is involved. And I believe that it's done kind of in collaboration with the CMM, the Montreal Metropolitan Community, and a bunch of different actors. But it's kind of a weird beast of a project because it's truly regional in scope. and the CMM, the Montreal Metropolitan Community, doesn't necessarily have the financing to manage a project like that.
So GO Transit, Metrolinx, is regional in scope and has got quite an extensive plan for electrification and expansion, et cetera, of trains, et cetera, light rail around the Greater Toronto Area.
Yeah,
and it's a provincial entity, and it reports to effectively the Minister of Transportation and the Premier, because there is no structure regionally that it could end up reporting to. And so, effectively, that's why some people think the Premier of Ontario is effectively the mayor of the Greater Toronto Area. And you think about it, the city of Toronto, the city of Mississauga, the city of Brampton, the city of Markham, other than trying to lobby them and try to influence them the way that anyone might, don't really have a vote in what Metrolinx is doing. And so, I think that having your regional government in Montreal that can have a regional point of view is a lot more successful than this fragmentation that you have in the Greater Toronto Area.
Yeah, I think one thing that's really, a kind of important distinction to make is that it's not to say that provinces shouldn't be involved in what the cities are doing, and especially because cities in Canada have such a kind of like have a really low amount of possibility of making money. They basically rely on property taxes and parking tickets to raise revenue. It's a bit more complex in reality, but they have a really kind of like constrained fiscal capacity. So you need provinces at the table to kind of help finance projects. And if in reality, if you need a kind of like larger scope that can fit within a broader structural plan, that's not a problem. And I think transportation is a really great example. TransLink in Vancouver, it has a really robust relationship with the provincial government. I believe it's governed in collaboration with the Vancouver region and the province. Kind of likewise in Montreal, though, as I mentioned, the transportation system in Montreal with public transit is a bit more complex, a bit more fragmented, actually. I think that there's a kind of degree to which you could argue that provincial involvement is good, but a bit of heavy-handedness can be detrimental to.
I'm not arguing against provincial involvement, but when it's just the province and the cities have no, I'll give you another example: the Ontario line, which is a new subway that's being put in place, came from the province without ever being thought of, talked about, planned before. City of Toronto and in any other city had zero to do with it, and it's all in the city of Toronto, and it's the province decided where it went.
And I think actually a good contrasting example to what you're saying is that in Montreal, the extension of the Blue Line, which will go a bit more farther east on the island, was basically lobbied on behalf of the city of Montreal, which governs kind of the Société de Transport de Montréal, which is the kind of TTC equivalent. It would have lobbied the provincial government, and it also would have lobbied the federal government for funding. So you're right. There's a kind of serious distinction there between the Premier of Ontario being Toronto's mayor, versus the way that the kind of Montreal's projects get initiated.
Okay, you wanted to give me two other examples. You wanted to compare Highway 413 and the Grand Western Park, the Grand Parc de l'Ouest. Tell me about that comparison.
Yeah, so kind of the big thrust of my master's research is trying to understand how a regional approach that fosters collaboration and cooperation between municipalities might kind of shape projects differently. And I think that you have two really good examples, one in Highway 413 in the Toronto region, and then one in the Grand Parc de l'Ouest, or the Great Western Park. It doesn't translate perfectly, in the Montreal area. Basically because both of these projects traverse multiple municipalities and jurisdictions within the same metropolitan region. So with Highway 413, I'm sure people are already quite aware of it because it's quite a controversial project. But it basically starts in the eastern part of the Toronto region, and it ends in the western part of it. It crosses exclusively Greater Toronto municipalities, and it is completely a provincial project. And one thing that's really interesting is that there's a lot of disagreement between municipalities, even between regions, on who wants the project and who doesn't want the project. Some municipalities have gone back and forth. I believe Vaughan was initially for it, and then it repealed its support. You have Mississauga, which is vociferously against the project. You have Brampton, Brampton, Mississauga within the same region. Brampton, which is, officially for the project. So there's really no cohesive vision on what people on what elected officials, but also what municipalities and what regions want kind of for what this project should look like. And that basically means that the province of Ontario can kind of step in and go, you guys can't figure out what you want. We're going to do this. It almost is like a fragmentation and exploitation as a result. Because it kind of makes it seem like the municipalities need the province to step in and kind of clean up their affairs. Versus in Montreal, you have this kind of giant western park that's supposed to cross the West Island, and then an island in the middle of the river to the north. And it was basically initiated by the city of Montreal and Western municipalities and done within the framework of the Montreal metropolitan community. So the Montreal metropolitan community has set its own conservation targets. And the conservation targets recently went up to 30%. So, the entire scope of the Montreal area, 82 municipalities, they've basically agreed to maintain, 30% of like green spaces and forests and like wet zones. And with the Great Western Park, it required basically both intermunicipal collaboration and the scope that the CMM provided to kind of frame the project in the right way. And I think, what's really interesting to make the comparison a bit clearer is that basically for the Great Western Park, the province had planned a major expansion of a highway that would have linked Laval to the western part of the Montreal Island. But that highway would have crossed through what is now the Great Western Park, what's being planned to be. And through lobbying from the city of Montreal and the CMM, basically the province said, okay, we'll back down on this highway project that we don't need, and we'll instead allow you to build a connector between the Great Western Park and the eastern and central part of Montreal that'll integrate stuff like bike lanes, a train, basically, the kind of opposite of what new highway planning seeks to do.
So regional government in your analysis worked and fragmentation didn't work. And that's the argument that I gave you for LA County and for Denver. And I think there's other examples as well. The DART in Dallas that is being done on a regional basis. I think that there's a couple of other institutions that on their own behalf have decided that regional structures make sense. The Toronto Region Board of Trade is a regional board of trade that is not just Toronto, but it's Toronto, Mississauga, York, etc. The United Way merged. The United Way of Peel, the United Way of Toronto, the United Way of York all merged into one entity. Habitat for Humanity in Peel and Halton has merged. Hospitals have merged between Mississauga and Toronto. The airport is effectively run by an organization that is Government of Ontario, Government of Canada, Toronto, and Mississauga. So, I think a lot of organizations are really ahead of government and are adapting to the fact that Joe Barrage talked about, that we're a regional entity. We're not each one of the separate parts. And transit, highways, sewage, water, planning, development, housing, so many issues cross boundaries. And, when you think about Mississauga was amalgamated itself. At one point in time, it was Cooksville and Streetsville and Port Credit, et cetera. And it was amalgamated. And at the time, the mayor of Streetsville, Hazen McCallion, objected to it, campaigned vociferously against it, thought it would be just terrible, and then realized it was great and became the mayor of Mississauga and lasted for 36 years. So people are opposed to change a lot of times, but when the change happens and they see that it's actually better, I think they adapt and they accept it over time. There's not many people that would be arguing today for a de-amalgamation of Toronto. Not one of the mayoralty candidates in this by-election that we're having for the mayor of Toronto has been arguing for de-amalgamation. I think because people think that, I didn't like it all that much because I like being in Scarborough or Toronto or Etobicoke, but it actually makes sense.
Yeah. I mean, it's kind of it's basically a question of scale, right? And I think this is like what makes these kind of questions so interesting. I think on paper it's like, oh, urban region governance, it could kind of maybe cause some people to fall asleep. But I think what's really interesting about it is it's basically a question of like, at what scale do things run the best, the most efficiently, the easiest for people to understand with the least friction? We have a great example in public transit, that maybe public transit, at an economy of scale, at a regional scale, is a bit easier for people, causes less friction. They can get, they can get to work a bit easier. They have a little bit less difficulty kind of navigating a system. I think what happens sometimes in the conversations on amalgamation is that, there's this idea of like efficiency and, the public sector as something that should run as like a purely efficient system, rather than one that operates on kind of like we care about our municipalities. They're the closest government to us. We should have a say in the way that they operate. We should have a say in if they fuse or if they don't fuse together. I don't think that the like Anglophone municipalities on the West Island of Montreal should necessarily be compelled or obliged to be in the same city as the city of Montreal, which is the city that I live in and that I love. So I think it's both a question of scale, and it's a question of kind of people's emotional attachments to democracy, to local expression, to seeing themselves represented by their municipalities. And it's just kind of these like big existential questions that I think are fascinating. So I think you're right that it's like, should things change? Yes. I think it's the way that they should change that we should figure out maybe how to fine tune a little bit more, and maybe in a way that's a little bit less heavy-handed. The province municipality relationship in Canada is one that is explicitly set up to be heavy-handed. So just some small existential questions to ask ourselves, I think.
Josh Medicoff, McGill University master's student in political science. Thank you very much for sharing some of your thoughts on regional governance in Toronto versus Montreal with us. If people want to check out your article, is there a website they can go to Policy Options or something like that they can get your article?
Yep, it's on Policy Options, and it's also on my website, which is just joshmedicoff.com.
I appreciate it. I'm going to have to read the whole article. When do I get to read the whole thesis?
The whole thesis will be published, well, let's hope by the end of the summer. I'm working on it right now. I'm doing interviews. I'm getting a kind of a better sense of how all of these things operate, because there's a lot, even though municipalities are small, there's a lot of layers to the way that they work.
Well, thank you very much. Really appreciate it. We're going to take a final break and come back, and I'm going to give you my 2 cents on this topic. Josh has his chance. I'm going to give you my 2 cents on regional government in the Greater Toronto Area just after the break. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. I think this has been a really interesting conversation with Josh Medicoff about regional governance and his example of Montreal versus Toronto. This is something that I've been really thinking about and focused on for quite a long period of time. It's something I've raised with the former mayor of Mississauga, Hazel McCallion. I had a really interesting conversation with two former premiers of Ontario on the topic. And I really think that Joe Barrage, who I quoted earlier, had it right, is that we got to change our attitude in Toronto. We got to be thinking about Toronto of the future, the third largest metropolitan area in all of North America, competing really with LA and New York, bigger than Chicago, bigger than Dallas, bigger than Houston, bigger than Miami, et cetera. And thinking about if that's what we are going to be, and we are going to be it, to put it in perspective, Josh, there is a population the size of the city of Montreal moving to Toronto in the next 7 to 10 years. And we got to, therefore, we got to think about what's the right way to run the place. And our transit crosses borders. And at one point in time, the TTC, just until very recently, never crossed the Toronto border. And maybe those subways should. The GO Transit system is more and more every day integrating the different cities and regions around Toronto into the Greater Toronto Area. And there's a big argument about having nodes, urban nodes that aren't just in downtown Toronto, but are in downtown Mississauga, in Brampton, in Vaughan, et cetera, et cetera. So I think we got to think about a different kind of government. And as I mentioned earlier, in 1996, there was this proposal, the GTA task force, and maybe it was, 20 or 30 years too early, but it recommended the amalgamation of Mississauga, Brampton, and Caledon into one city, Peel. And Josh raised this argument about thinking about rural areas versus urban areas that may not want to be together. And so I accept that. And so I could think that Caledon, for an example, might want to join the regional municipality that's far more rural, that's just north of Caledon. And you might have that same argument with Halton Hills or Georgetown in Halton versus Oakville and Burlington and Milton, which are becoming more and more, one city and integrated with each other and with the greater Toronto area. And I think in Durham and in York, you might find as well cities on the outskirts that might not make logical sense to go with what I'm talking about. But in Mississauga and Brampton and Peel, the vast majority of people, 57% of the people in Mississauga, have lived in Canada for less than 10 years. They don't know where the Mississauga-Brampton border is, and they cross over that border all the time. Sewage, water, police already, fire probably in the future, really are of a Mississauga and Brampton basis and Oakville, Burlington basis. And where does Vaughan, Richmond Hill, Markham, one end and the other begin? So I think this idea of amalgamation, and really that people would think that amalgamation in Toronto, they didn't like it. No one likes change, but today no one would be arguing against amalgamation, for de-amalgamation. Ottawa combining with Canada, Orleans, Gloucester made sense. Hamilton combining with Ancaster and other places made sense. I think it makes sense to seriously consider amalgamating Mississauga and Brampton into one city, Oakville, Burlington, Milton into one city, York into one city, Pickering, Oshawa, Ajax into one city, and then creating those four cities along with the city of Toronto into a new Greater Toronto Area Council. Maybe not a upper tier council like the old Metro Toronto Council, but a council that gets together on a fairly frequent basis and makes decisions on a regular basis. You've got Global Toronto, you've got the Toronto Regional Board of Trade, you've got the United Way of Toronto that are already all organized in that kind of a fashion. And I think those other organizations are telling Toronto, what is the regional entity that should exist. And I think that would be consistent with this vision of what Toronto is going to be as the third largest city in North America, and would allow us to have transit and planning, the Toronto Regional Conservation Authority that's, conservation area for the whole area. Everything that we're doing, airports, railways, would be planned on a far more consistent regional basis. And I think makes a lot more sense. Would it be scary to people that live in Port Credit or live in the old town of Markham or Unionville? Yeah, but any kind of change is, and it's the right thing for us to be thinking. And I think Josh, even though he doesn't accept it, has proven that it works in Montreal. And I think that if you looked at Vancouver, if you looked at LA, if you looked at Denver, those examples, if you looked at New York, that took 5 boroughs and amalgamated into one city, it makes sense. And it's something we should think about. Anyway, my 2 cents. Thanks for joining us. Josh, we really appreciate it. That's our show for tonight. I remind you, I'm on every Monday through Friday at 6 o'clock on 960 AM. You can stream me online, even from Montreal, at www.saga960am.ca. Good night, everybody.